What if the man who played some of Hollywood's most chilling villains witnessed real evil behind the scenes that made his on-screen performances look tame? Richard Widmark spent decades in the golden age of Hollywood, and what he saw during those years would make your blood run cold. Before his death, this legendary actor who knew how to portray darkness on screen decided to reveal the truth about 5 men whose real-life behavior was far more sinister than any movie role. These are not just stories of difficult personalities or artistic temperaments. These are accounts of genuine evil that festered in the heart of America's dream factory while the world remained blind to the truth. Before we dive into video, please subscribe to our channel. Richard Widmark was not just any actor sharing gossip or rumors. This was a man who commanded respect throughout his 50-year career in Hollywood. He broke into the industry with his unforgettable role as the psychopathic Tommy Udo in Kiss of Death, where he pushed an old woman in a wheelchair down a flight of stairs. That chilling laugh and cold-blooded performance earned him an Oscar nomination and established him as one of the greatest character actors of his generation. But Widmark was more than just a talented performer. He was known throughout Hollywood as a man of integrity and principle. He chose his roles carefully and spoke his mind when others remained silent. So when Richard Widmark decided to talk about the evil he witnessed during Hollywood's golden age, people listened because they knew he would not exaggerate or lie for attention. Number 1. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn is the first actor Richard Widmark exposed, and the revelations about him are deeply disturbing. Errol Flynn was the ultimate swashbuckling hero of the 1930s and 1940s. He played Robin Hood and pirates and adventure heroes with such charm and athleticism that audiences could not get enough of him. But according to Widmark, the real Errol Flynn was a predator who used his fame and good looks to prey on young girls. Flynn had a well-documented history of relationships with underage girls and was even put on trial for statutory rape in 1942. He was acquitted, but the evidence presented at trial painted a picture of a man who regularly invited teenage girls onto his yacht and his estate for parties where alcohol and drugs flowed freely. Widmark talked about how everyone in Hollywood knew about Flynn's behavior, but nobody did anything to stop it. The studios protected him because his movies made enormous profits. Flynn himself bragged about his conquests and showed no shame or remorse about the girls whose lives he damaged. He died at the age of 50 from years of hard living and excess, but he never faced real consequences for the harm he caused to vulnerable young women who trusted him because of his movie star status. Number 2. John Barrymore. John Barrymore is the second name on Richard Widmark's list, and this revelation focuses on a different kind of evil. John Barrymore was one of the most celebrated actors of the early 20th century. He came from the famous Barrymore acting dynasty and was known as one of the greatest Hamlets ever to grace the stage. But his personal life was a disaster marked by alcoholism and abusive behavior toward the women in his life. Widmark spoke about how Barrymore would get violently drunk and terrorize his wives and girlfriends. He went through 4 marriages, and each one ended because of his drinking and his inability to treat women with basic respect and decency. But what Widmark found most evil about Barrymore was how he destroyed the career and life of his own daughter, Diana Barrymore. John was an absent and neglectful father who showed no interest in Diana until she became a beautiful young woman and tried to follow in his footsteps as an actress. Then he became jealous and possessive and would sabotage her career opportunities while also encouraging her to drink with him. Diana struggled with alcoholism her entire adult life and died at the age of 38. Widmark believed that John Barrymore's toxic influence and his introduction of his own daughter to the addiction that plagued him was an act of profound evil that showed just how selfish and destructive he truly was. Number 3. Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes is the third name Richard Widmark revealed. And while Hughes was primarily known as a businessman and aviator, his impact on Hollywood was significant and deeply harmful. Howard Hughes owned RKO Pictures and used his position to control and manipulate the careers and personal lives of numerous actresses. Widmark described Hughes as a man obsessed with power and control who saw women as possessions to be acquired and discarded. Hughes would sign young actresses to contracts and then essentially own them. He would decide who they could date and what roles they could take and how they should look and behave. If they resisted his control, he would simply refuse to put them in any films, while also preventing them from working anywhere else because of their contracts. Jane Russell and Jean Harlow and many others suffered under Hughes's controlling behavior. But according to Widmark, the most evil aspect of Hughes was his complete lack of empathy. He did not see the women he controlled as human beings with their own dreams and desires. They were objects that existed for his amusement and his profit. When he grew bored with them, he would destroy their careers without a second thought. The psychological damage he inflicted on the women who had the misfortune of signing contracts with him lasted long after their professional relationships ended. Number 4. Charles Chaplin. Charles Chaplin is the fourth actor on Richard Widmark's list, and this revelation shocked many people who saw Chaplin as a genius and a humanitarian. Charles Chaplin was one of the most important figures in cinema history. His Little Tramp character brought joy to millions, and his films combined comedy with social commentary in ways that had never been done before. But according to Widmark, there was a dark side to Chaplin that the public never saw. Chaplin had a disturbing pattern of relationships with very young girls. His second wife, Lita Gray, was only 16 when he got her pregnant and married her to avoid scandal. He was 35 at the time. His third wife, Paulette Goddard, was allegedly only 17 when they began their relationship, though the exact timeline has always been murky. His fourth wife, Una O'Neill, was only 18 when the 54-year-old Chaplin married her. Widmark talked about how Chaplin seemed incapable of having relationships with adult women who could challenge him as equals. He sought out teenage girls who would worship him and submit to his control. The power imbalance in these relationships was extreme and troubling. Widmark also spoke about how Chaplin could be cruel and vindictive to people who worked for him. He was a perfectionist who would berate and humiliate actors and crew members if they did not meet his exacting standards. Behind the lovable tramp persona was a man who used his genius as an excuse for behavior that hurt many people throughout his long career. Number 5. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra is the fifth and final name Richard Widmark exposed, and the revelations about him focus on violence and connections to organized crime. Frank Sinatra was more than just a singer and actor. He was a cultural icon who defined cool for an entire generation. But according to Widmark, the real Sinatra had a vicious temper and a mean streak that he directed at anyone who crossed him or failed to show him the respect he thought he deserved. There are numerous documented incidents of Sinatra getting into physical fights or threatening people. He allegedly had connections to major mob figures and would use those connections to intimidate people in the industry. Widmark described an incident where Sinatra became enraged at a journalist who had written something he did not like and had his associates rough up the writer as a warning. The culture of fear that surrounded Sinatra was real. People were afraid to criticize him or turn down his demands because they knew he had the power and the willingness to make their lives miserable. Widmark also talked about how Sinatra treated women. Despite his romantic image, Sinatra could be crude and disrespectful to women he considered beneath him. He expected women to be available for his pleasure and became angry when they asserted their independence. The contrast between his smooth public image and his violent private behavior was stark and disturbing. Widmark believed that Sinatra's evil came from his sense of entitlement and his belief that the rules that governed normal people did not apply to him because of his talent and fame. What makes Richard Widmark's testimony about these 5 men so powerful is that he had nothing to gain from speaking out. By the time he shared these stories, he was already retired from acting and living a quiet private life. He was not promoting a book or trying to restart his career. He simply felt that the truth needed to be told before everyone who witnessed the golden age of Hollywood passed away. Widmark understood that history was being sanitized, and that future generations would only know the carefully crafted public images of these men unless someone spoke up about what really happened behind the scenes. The 5 men Widmark named represent different types of evil that flourished in old Hollywood. Errol Flynn was a sexual predator who used his status to abuse young girls. John Barrymore was a violent alcoholic who destroyed everyone close to him, including his own daughter. Howard Hughes was a controlling manipulator who treated women as property. Charles Chaplin was a genius who used his talent as cover for inappropriate relationships with teenagers. Frank Sinatra was a volatile and violent man who used fear and mob connections to get what he wanted. Each of them caused real harm to real people, and each of them was protected by a system that valued fame and profit over justice and human decency. Richard Widmark often spoke about how the studio system enabled this kind of behavior. The major studios in the Golden Age had almost complete control over the industry. They owned the theaters where movies were shown, and the production facilities where movies were made, and the contracts of the actors and directors who made the movies. This vertical integration gave them enormous power, and they used that power to protect their investments. If a star like Errol Flynn or Frank Sinatra got into trouble, the studio would step in to fix it. They had lawyers to handle legal problems, and publicists to manage the press, and fixers to pay off victims or witnesses. The police and the courts often cooperated because the studios brought jobs and prestige to Los Angeles. This system created an environment where certain men learned they could get away with almost anything. They could abuse women and children, and they could drink and do drugs, and they could be violent and cruel, and there would be no real consequences as long as they kept making money for the studios. The message was clear that talent and profitability mattered more than morality or the law. Widmark found this systemic enabling to be just as evil as the individual acts committed by the 5 men he named. But Richard Widmark also emphasized that not everyone in old Hollywood was evil or complicit. There were many good people who tried to do the right thing within a corrupt system. There were actors and directors who treated people with respect and used their influence to help others rather than hurt them. There were studio employees who tried to protect vulnerable young performers from predators. There were journalists who attempted to expose wrongdoing, even when their stories were killed by editors who were afraid of the studio's power. Widmark wanted to make clear that his condemnation of these 5 men and the system that protected them was not a condemnation of everyone who worked in Hollywood during that era. The question that Widmark often returned to was what allowed these men to become so evil. Were they corrupted by fame and power, or were they always this way? And Hollywood simply gave them the opportunity to act on their worst impulses. Widmark believed it was a combination of both. Some of these men likely had predatory or violent tendencies before they became famous, but the culture of Hollywood amplified those tendencies and removed the normal checks that society places on bad behavior. When you are told every day that you are special and important and that normal rules do not apply, to you it becomes easier to justify treating other people as less than human. Fame also isolated these men from normal social relationships and normal consequences. They lived in a bubble surrounded by people who depended on them for employment or who wanted something from them. They rarely encountered anyone who would tell them no or challenge their behavior. This isolation allowed their worst traits to flourish unchecked. By the time anyone tried to intervene, the patterns were so deeply established that change was nearly impossible. Richard Widmark also talked about the role that substance abuse played in enabling evil behavior. Several of the men he named, including John Barrymore and Errol Flynn, were serious alcoholics. Frank Sinatra and Howard Hughes both abused prescription drugs. Alcohol and drugs lowered inhibitions and increased aggression and paranoia. They also provided convenient excuses for bad behavior. A man could beat his wife or sexually assault a young woman and then blame it on being drunk and expect forgiveness. The culture of Hollywood encouraged heavy drinking and drug use as part of the glamorous lifestyle, and this contributed to creating environments where abuse could flourish. The impact of these 5 men's evil behavior extended far beyond their immediate victims. They set examples that other powerful men in Hollywood followed. They created a culture where abuse and exploitation were normalized and expected. Young actors entering the industry learned that this was just how things worked, and that if they wanted to succeed, they needed to either participate in the system or at least stay quiet about what they witnessed. This culture persisted for decades, and in many ways continues to this day despite increased awareness and efforts at reform. Richard Widmark's revelations also raise important questions about how we remember and celebrate figures from the past. All 5 of the men he named made significant contributions to cinema and entertainment. Errol Flynn's adventure films are still exciting to watch. John Barrymore's performances were genuinely brilliant. Howard Hughes advanced aviation technology and produced some notable films. Charles Chaplin created some of the most important movies ever made. Frank Sinatra's music continues to be beloved by millions. Should their artistic achievements excuse or erase their evil behavior? Widmark firmly believed they should not. He argued that we can acknowledge someone's talent while also acknowledging the harm they caused. We do not have to choose between celebrating the art and condemning the artist. We can do both. In fact, Widmark believed we must do both if we want to have an honest understanding of history and prevent similar abuses in the future. Pretending that these men were saints or that their evil behavior did not happen is a form of lying that dishonors their victims and makes it easier for the next generation of abusers to operate. The 5 men Richard Widmark exposed were all dead by the time he spoke publicly about them. Some people criticized him for this and said he was attacking people who could not defend themselves. But Widmark rejected this criticism. He pointed out that these men never faced real accountability during their lifetimes, and that their victims deserved to have their stories validated, even if justice was no longer possible. He also noted that the myths and legends surrounding these men continued to influence Hollywood culture, and that exposing the truth about them was necessary to break those harmful patterns. Richard Widmark's own career stood in stark contrast to the men he condemned. He was known throughout the industry as a professional who treated everyone on set with respect. He was married to the same woman for 55 years until her death. He avoided the party scene and the excesses that destroyed so many of his contemporaries. He chose roles based on their quality rather than just their paychecks. And he walked away from projects when he felt they compromised his principles. His integrity gave weight to his accusations because people knew he was not a hypocrite speaking about sins he himself had committed. In his final interviews, before his death in 2008, Richard Widmark expressed hope that Hollywood had learned from the mistakes of the Golden Age. He acknowledged that progress had been made in terms of how women and minorities were treated in the industry. He noted that the old studio system had collapsed and that power was more distributed than it had been in his youth. But he also warned that the fundamental dynamics that enabled evil in old Hollywood still existed. There were still powerful men who believed they were above the rules. There were still vulnerable people trying to break into the industry who could be exploited. There was still a tendency to protect profitable stars even when their behavior was clearly wrong. The 5 men Richard Widmark named in his revelations about Hollywood's golden age represent a dark chapter in entertainment history that must not be forgotten. Errol Flynn and John Barrymore and Howard Hughes and Charles Chaplin and Frank Sinatra all used their power and fame to hurt other people, and they were protected by a system that valued money over morality. Their victims suffered in silence for decades, and many never received justice or even acknowledgement of what was done to them. By speaking out, Richard Widmark honored those victims and challenged all of us to think critically about the celebrities we admire and the systems that create and protect them. His courage in telling these difficult truths stands as a reminder that real heroism often happens off-screen, and that speaking truth to power matters more than maintaining comfortable illusions about the past.